Hi, I'm Aislinn Antrim from Pharmacy Times. Before we get started today, one of our top stories right now is about research which found that about 20% of COVID-19 patients show only gastrointestinal symptoms. So there's more about that on Pharmacy Times. Today, I'm speaking again with Michael Haydock, Senior Director of Cardiovascular, Metabolic, and Infectious Diseases Content at Informa Pharma Intelligence, about the development of therapeutics for COVID-19. So Michael, of course, we've heard a lot about the vaccine development process, but what is the process for therapeutics for COVID-19?
So overall, it's quite similar. You start again with phase one. All trials will start there, where you're looking primarily for safety, and that's usually in healthy subjects. So you just give them small doses of the drug, often in ascending doses, and you're just looking to see what the adverse event profile looks like, how the pharmacokinetics looks. So you see how long the drug persists in their body, for example, and that helps you identify the dose that's likely to be therapeutic and safe at the same time. Then you'd move on to phase two, which is in actual COVID subjects in this case. Where you'd be looking at infected people, again, looking for safety, but also trying to identify the dose that seems to give you a good balance of efficacy. And once you've identified that, assuming that trial is positive, you then move into phase three, which is a large-scale trial in hundreds of people, again, looking for safety, but also effectiveness. And because those trials are so large, you've got a lot more statistical power to be able to detect a benefit there. So that's in short how it goes. It's obviously been a lot faster for COVID. Again, similar to vaccines, drugs usually take about 10 years or so to develop. But obviously we've had some emergency authorizations within about 6 or 9 months. So again, it's very fast. And that's partially because some of the drugs that are being investigated are repurposed. So we already know they're safe from use in other indications. So that lets us speed up the process a bit more.
Wonderful. Well, that links to my next question. Of all the therapeutics being investigated, kind of what's the breakdown of what's repurposed drugs? What are some new novel drugs? How many of which? What are we looking at there?
Yeah, so overall, there's close to 500 drugs in the pipeline just in the US alone in clinical development. So there's a huge number. Most of them that we've seen data for at the moment are repurposed, and that's largely just because of what I mentioned. They're able to progress faster, so you get the data out for them faster. So things like for Chlorine Dexamethasone, those two drugs that are quite widely used now in hospitalized patients, they're both repurposed. The Chlorine, for example, was being developed for Ebola. It actually failed there, but they kind of repurposed the drug because it has quite a broad antiviral spectrum in terms of how it works. But there are new ones as well. So there's lots of new oral antivirals being developed. Veklury is intravenous, so it's not that convenient, particularly outside of hospitals. So there are people developing oral versions. And then there's a host of other new immunomodulatory drugs that try and dampen the immune response, because that seems to be what drives a lot of the pathology in people who are hospitalized. It's trying to stop the immune response being over-exaggerated and actually causing more harm than benefit.
Wonderful. Remdesivir is, of course, the first FDA-approved therapeutic in the US. Can you discuss that drug and its uses?
Yeah, so it's approved at the moment for hospitalized patients. So we don't use it in an outpatient setting. That's mainly because they haven't shown the data in there yet, but also it's intravenous, so it's not particularly convenient for those patients anyway. And there's very limited supply, so they're really prioritizing it to the hospitalized setting. In terms of what it showed, they had a few studies, but the main one that's prompted its uptake in hospitalized patients was called the ACT-1 study, where they compared it against best supportive care, and they showed a reduction in recovery time. So it was 10 days when you treat with remdesivir versus 15 days when you treat with placebo and best supportive care. So there's a clear benefit there. And then there was a hint of a mortality benefit, but it didn't show statistical significance. So they just missed that. But then they did a post-hoc analysis, which is where you look at a specific subgroup of patients. And they showed on those who have low flow oxygen use, so those who are severe but on the lower end of severe, because it's quite a spectrum, those patients, it did have a mortality benefit, but because it was a kind of post-hoc analysis, it wasn't something they pre-specified in the trial. They didn't get a specific claim for that. So some people believe it will give a mortality benefit, but there's no specific claim on its label. So it's mainly the go-to option, really. If you're hospitalized with the virus, you usually get remdesivir.
Wonderful. Although it's been approved, the studies have shown some contradictory results, as you mentioned, with some trials finding no benefit, others saying it reduced hospitalization times. How are these contradictory findings resolved, and how can they be understood?
Yeah, it's a really good question. To be honest, I don't think you can resolve them as such. They're a slightly different trials. So the study I just mentioned was in just over 1,000 people. I think roughly half got remdesivir, or roughly half got placebo, so maybe around 500 or so in remdesivir. The Solidarity trial, which is the other trial you're referring to, that the World Health Organization conducted, I think they had about 5 times as many people on remdesivir in that trial. So it's a much bigger trial, and they didn't show a benefit there. The Solidarity trial was spread a lot more global. So ACT-1 did have global sites, but a lot of the patients were in the US. And so there are like varying levels of standard of care that in the background therapy. So that is probably a bit of a confounding factor that made the results differ, but I don't think there is an easy explanation. Personally, I'd probably put more faith in the Solidarity trial just because it is so large. So it may well be that remdesivir isn't actually that beneficial, but I think in the short term, at least, while there are no other antiviral drugs approved, I'm sure remdesivir will continue to be used because it's probably better than nothing. We know it's safe. So I'm sure it'll keep being used as standard of care, but once some oral antivirals come on, then I'm sure it'll face a big challenge there.
Absolutely. Antibody therapies have also gotten a lot of attention. Can you talk about these options and what's being investigated there?
Yeah, they're a really interesting approach. So they're a novel class, and there's 2 of them. One actually gained emergency use authorization in the US earlier this week, one made by Eli Lilly, and then there's another antibody as well, made by Regeneron. They currently have shown efficacy in the outpatient setting. So if you're not hospitalized and you've got mild to moderate infection, they've shown quite good reductions in the percentage of people who either have to go to hospital or who have to seek medical assistance in either way, whether that's emergency room visit or just going to the local physician. So they've shown about 70% or so reduction in the number of people who have to do that. So that's really promising because they kind of act as a stopgap between nothing and vaccines, because obviously in the long term vaccines will probably take that role of preventing people going to hospital, but in the short term these antibodies seem like a good option. The downside is that they again are intravenous, so and there's quite limited supply. Antibodies are quite complex to make and quite expensive, so there's going to be limited supply. So the US government will have to figure out who exactly it wants to allocate those supplies to. It's probably going to be the elderly and another risk factor. So maybe obesity, diabetes, for example, they have to try and prioritize those patients.
Absolutely. We've heard various things about when or how antibody therapies might be useful, whether it's prophylaxis or in mild cases. Can you talk about those questions?
Yeah, so I've partially covered mild already. Prophylaxis obviously is a slightly different setting because you're not infected at that point. So a mild patient obviously has active infection. So they probably will work. We don't have data yet in the prophylaxis setting because their trials for that were a bit later than the ones they set up for the outpatients. But given that Pfizer's vaccine, obviously we had the good news for that, and that is known to stimulate antibodies, it's a reasonable conclusion to imply, well, therefore that an antibody therapy would also provide protection because you're just giving that directly rather than giving them the vaccine that ultimately ends up with them producing antibodies. So I think they probably will work, but their use in that setting is probably going to be quite short-lived because obviously vaccines are much, much cheaper to roll out overall. If you look, Lilly, I think they said the price of one dose of their antibody is $1,250, whereas Pfizer's vaccine would cost about $40 or so to vaccinate a person. So obviously it's a lot cheaper to go with vaccines, and it's just more convenient because you don't have to have people getting intravenous infusions. So it's probably, again, going to be a stopgap strategy. And for those who, for whatever reason, can't take a vaccine, then you could get the antibody instead.
Absolutely. Lilly's, I might mispronounce this, Olumiant is also looking promising as the most advanced immunomodulatory drug. Can you explain what that means and how it's being investigated?
Yeah, so an immunomodulatory drug is effectively a drug that tries to dampen the immune response. So part of the issue in hospitalized patients is that for some reason, it's not entirely known why, some people seem to have an exaggerated immune response to the virus that causes more damage than benefit. And so these immunomodulatory drugs try and dampen that immune response and stop you progressing to severe disease. And hopefully reducing risk of death, etc., in those who are hospitalized. So Olumiant showed a pretty modest benefit. They investigated it on top of remdesivir. So it's either you get remdesivir alone or you get Olumiant plus remdesivir. and they showed a 1-day reduction in hospitalization time. So I think you recovered on average after 7 days if you used Olumiant versus 8 days of remdesivir. So it's a very small benefit, but in cases where, you know, hospitals might be being overwhelmed, if you could get patients out a day faster, obviously that's potentially beneficial there. They also showed signs of a mortality benefit, but it wasn't statistically significant in the overall analysis. So they had a 35% reduction in death, which might sound quite a lot, but the trial wasn't that big. So it wasn't statistically significant. So they probably won't get a claim for that. And that was, again, in hospitalized patients, so those with moderate to severe infections.
Wonderful. Well, lastly, I know you said there's 500 of these being investigated, but are there any other drugs that pharmacists should keep an eye on?
I think probably the next wave that will make a difference is the oral antivirals. So I mentioned remdesivir is obviously limited to hospitals at the moment. Gilead is actually intending to develop an inhaled version, which would be more convenient outside of hospitals, but oral would still probably be more convenient than that as well. So there are various developers. Merck has an antiviral. Roche as well recently bought up did a partnership with a smaller company to get an oral antiviral. And then there's a drug called favipiravir, which works in the same way as remdesivir, but again, is orally given. That's actually already approved in Russia and India and quite widely used, but they're still in phase 2 trials in the US. So that would probably be the next wave. And then there are various other immunomodulatory drugs as well that might be able to help a little bit earlier than dexamethasone does. So dexamethasone is the steroid widely cheaply available, been used for decades, that only seems to provide a mortality benefit in those at the very end of the spectrum on mechanical ventilation, so the really advanced patients. It's possible that these 100 or so other immunomodulatory drugs that are coming through might be able to provide benefit earlier on as well, because they disrupt various different aspects of immune signaling.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Now we're going to hear from some of our other MJH Life Sciences brands on their latest headlines.